There is a question that sometimes visits people in quiet moments, when the noise of achievement fades and the room finally becomes still. After everything I've worked for, why do I still feel like something important is missing? This story is a reflective, imagined narrative inspired by the lives and public personas of Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman, but it does not claim to describe their real conversations or private experiences. Instead, it gently explores a human truth that many can recognize: the way we discover what truly matters only after we have spent years chasing what we thought we needed. He was sitting alone in a hotel room, the kind that looks exactly like every other hotel room in the world. Beige walls, heavy curtains, a small table in the corner with a bowl of polished fruit no one ever eats. The kind of place where time doesn't pass so much as sit politely and wait. It was late, but not so late that he could pretend he didn't have time to think. The city outside was humming softly. He could hear the faint echo of traffic several floors below. His phone lay upside down on the table, deliberately silenced, as if turning it over might turn his thoughts off too. Keanu had just come back from an event where people had congratulated him, praised him, told him how much his work meant to them. Hands on his shoulders, cameras in his face, polite laughter in his ears. He had smiled, listened, thanked them. And none of it was false. He was genuinely grateful. But now, in the stillness, another feeling sat with him. It was not sadness exactly. More like a quiet ache he couldn't quite name. A sense that, for all the applause, something essential remained untouched inside him. He glanced at the framed photograph he traveled with, propped against the bedside lamp. It was his mother, younger than he was now, hair pinned back, eyes bright with a tired kind of pride. The photo had been taken in a small apartment kitchen, the table cluttered with cheap groceries, her hands resting on the back of a worn-out chair. He remembered that kitchen like a familiar dream, how she would work long hours, come home exhausted, then stay up even longer helping him run lines or talking about his future. She had no guarantees to offer, only belief. And she gave that belief like someone giving away their last warm coat. He reached for the photo and held it in his hands, tracing the edge of the frame with his thumb. "So," he whispered into the empty room, "is this what you wanted for me?" He knew she had wanted him to be safe, to be okay, to have opportunities she never had. But had she wanted this? The flashing lights, the red carpets, the constant motion? Or had she hoped for something else, something quieter, something deeper, that he had mistaken for success? The questions rose, then softened, like waves that know better than to crash. That lingering ache, the one that arrived even on the best days, had been with him for a while. It came when he saw a family laughing together at a park. It came when he watched two old friends sitting on a bench, talking about nothing special and everything important. It came when he visited his mother's grave and found himself telling her stories about his schedule instead of his heart. He set the photo down again and sat back, resting his head against the wall. He thought of all the nights his mother had stayed awake, worrying about money, about his dreams, about whether the world would be kind to him. He thought of the way she had brushed his hair back from his forehead when he was a child, as if every touch could build a shield against future pain. She had sacrificed so much: sleep, comfort, her own ambitions, and he had always carried that knowledge like a silent promise on his back: I will make this worth it. And he had tried. Every role, every project, every long day on set had felt like a way of saying thank you to her. Look, Mom, it wasn't for nothing. You gave everything you had, and I turned it into something. But somewhere along the way, the thank you had gotten tangled up with the need to keep going, to keep climbing, to prove, to whom exactly, he wasn't sure anymore, that he was worthy of all she gave. Maybe that was what the ache really was. Not guilt, but the realization that it was possible to honor the sacrifice yet still miss its deeper meaning. He closed his eyes. A memory floated up. Years earlier, he had been on a set with Morgan Freeman. They weren't working on anything dramatic that day, just a quiet scene on a calm afternoon. Between takes, the crew adjusted lights and camera angles while the two of them sat in directors' chairs off to the side. Keanu remembered feeling tired that day, not just physically, but in the way a person grows tired from carrying something heavy for years. There were decisions to be made, offers on the table, expectations from all sides. Praise felt as heavy as criticism. Every yes seemed to borrow from some hidden part of his life he hadn't had time to live yet. He must have looked as worn as he felt, because Morgan had glanced over and studied his face with that steady, searching kindness he was known for. "You look like a man doing too much thinking and not enough living," Morgan had said, his voice low, almost amused. Keanu had given a small, self-conscious smile. "Maybe. Just a lot going on." "There's always a lot going on," Morgan replied. "That part doesn't change." They sat in silence for a moment. Nearby, someone called for a prop. A light stand clinked against the floor. Someone laughed at a joke half the room didn't hear. Morgan leaned back, eyes on the set in front of them. "I remember," he began, "when I first started getting steady work. I thought, this is it. This is what all those years were for. Now I have to say yes to everything. Make it all count." He paused. "Took me a long time to understand that not everything that counts can be counted in that way." Keanu had listened, curiosity quietly pushing past his fatigue. Morgan wasn't preaching. He was simply sharing, like someone laying objects out on a table and saying, "You may find something of yours here." "What changed?" Keanu had asked. Morgan smiled a little, not at the question but at an old memory only he could see. "I went home one day, after a long stretch of work," he said. "I was proud, you know. Really proud. I was providing, building a career, making a name. I walked in ready to feel good about it. And I saw this emptiness. Not because people didn't love me, but because I wasn't really there. I was around, I was visible, but I wasn't present." He shook his head slightly. "People had made space for me," he continued. "They'd waited for me. They were patient, understanding. But there are certain moments in life that don't wait for you. You can miss them while trying your best to be responsible." Keanu thought of all the times he had told himself he would slow down later, be more present later, make time for people later. Later, 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 as if life could be paused like a film scene and resumed on command. "So what did you do?" he had asked. Morgan looked at him directly, eyes soft but unflinching. "I started asking a different question," he said. "Not what do I have to do next, but what will I be glad I did when I'm old and looking back? Those are not always the same thing." Keanu held on to that sentence like a small stone in his pocket, something solid he could touch when the path felt unsteady. But he had still been in motion then, still running, still trying to balance gratitude and ambition, responsibility and rest. It's hard to slow down when your entire life has taught you that your worth is tied to how much you produce. Sitting in the hotel room years later, he remembered that quiet conversation more clearly than entire projects he had worked on. His mother's photo watched him from the table. It struck him that if he saw someone else living the way he did, constantly pulled by schedules, expected to be strong, endlessly grateful without room for simple, human weariness, he would feel compassion for them. But for himself, he reserved only pressure. He sighed softly, not in frustration, but in recognition. Maybe this was the heart of it. He had spent so long trying to make his mother's sacrifice mean something by succeeding, that he had forgotten the possibility that her greatest wish wasn't for him to be impressive, but for him to be at peace. He thought of all the time she had held his face between her hands and said, "I just want you to be happy." At the time, he had thought happiness meant doing well, being chosen, standing out. Now, he wondered if her idea of happiness had been simpler: shared meals, a safe home, people he could trust, a life that didn't demand he leave himself behind. He picked up the photo again and spoke to it as if she could hear. "You didn't give all of this," he murmured, "just so I could spend my life chasing the next thing, did you?" No answer came, of course, but he felt his shoulders loosen as if some invisible hand had let go. He thought again of Morgan's words, "What will I be glad I did when I'm old and looking back?" He imagined himself years from now, not on a screen, not on a stage, but alone in a small, quiet space like this one. What would he remember with warmth? The premieres? The interviews? The long nights on sets under hot lights? Some of those, yes, perhaps. There was real joy in the craft itself, a satisfaction he would never dismiss. But he suspected the things that would make his heart feel full in hindsight were smaller, less visible moments. Laughing over a simple meal with someone he trusted, walking down a street without being in a hurry, visiting his mother's grave without feeling he needed to justify how he had used his time, sitting with friends long after the topic of conversation had ceased to matter. These were not achievements in any public sense, but they were the fabric of a life that felt lived rather than managed. He realized something subtle but important. Honoring his mother did not require him to exhaust himself endlessly in her name. Gratitude didn't have to look like self-erasure. To truly respect what she had given up for him, he might need to let go of the belief that he had to earn his right to simply exist, to rest, to love, and be loved outside of what he did. That thought brought with it a quiet relief, but also a fear. If he stopped measuring his days by how much he accomplished, how would he know he was worthwhile? Sitting there, he understood how deeply that question had shaped him. As a younger man, he had learned to be tough, to keep moving, to accept loss and hardship without complaint. He had become resilient, reliable, hardworking. All of those qualities were real. But beneath them, there had always been that child hoping that if he did enough, he would finally feel secure, finally feel he was not a burden. Morgan's gentle voice in his memory nudged him toward another perspective. "Let me tell you something," Morgan had said that day on set, leaning in a little so that only he could hear. "Work is good. Success can be good. It lets you help people. It lets you express yourself. But when I think about what truly matters, it's very simple. Who did I love? Who loved me? Did I show up for them when it counted? Did I show up for myself?" He had paused, then added, "Awards don't sit by your bedside when you're sick. Fame doesn't call you just to ask how you're really doing. When the lights go out, it's the human connections that remain. Don't let the noise convince you otherwise." At the time, those words had sounded wise but distant, like advice from a future he hadn't reached yet. Now, alone in the quiet, they felt close enough to touch. Keanu set the photo back on the table with care, then stood and walked over to the window. He drew the curtains aside just enough to let in the city's muted glow. Cars moved like small streams of light below. Up here, no one was looking at him. No one expected anything from him. The anonymity of the moment felt like a gift. He rested his forehead against the cool glass and allowed himself to feel everything without editing it for anyone else's comfort. The gratitude for all he had been able to do. The sorrow for what had been lost along the way. The confusion of trying to be both a public figure and a private soul. The love for a mother who had done her best in a world that demanded too much of her. It occurred to him that the most honest way to honor her now might be to live in a way she never had the chance to allow himself rest, gentleness, and connection instead of only responsibility and effort. He didn't need to make a grand declaration or a radical change overnight. Life rarely shifts in sudden leaps. More often, it turns gradually, like a door opening a little wider each day. Maybe he could start with small choices. Saying no to something that looked impressive on paper but felt empty in his chest. Making time to call someone he cared about, not because there was news to share, but because he missed their voice. Sitting with his own feelings instead of outrunning them with more work. Honoring sacrifice, he realized, was not about building a monument to it. It was about living in a way that reflected its deepest intention. His mother had wanted him to be okay, to be whole, to be loved, to feel, in some quiet corner of himself, that he was enough. And Morgan, in his own way, had reminded him that the truest measure of a life was not the size of its audience, but the depth of its presence. Standing by the window, he let that understanding settle inside him like a stone sinking to the bottom of a clear lake. No splash, no drama. Just a new weight, gentle and grounding. He thought about how easy it is, for anyone, to get lost in what the world tells them matters. Titles, salaries, likes, status. How many people carried around the belief that they owed the world a performance in exchange for their right to be here? How rare it was to pause and ask, quietly, who am I when I'm not being useful? Do I still believe I deserve kindness then? The answer to that question, he suspected, shaped a person's entire life. As he stood there, he did not suddenly become a different man. He was still himself, with his history, his habits, his sense of duty. But something had shifted in the way he held his own story. He no longer saw his mother's sacrifices as a debt he could never fully repay. Instead, he began to see them as a gift given freely, a vote of confidence in his existence, long before he proved anything to anyone. A gift that said, "You are worth this effort, simply because you are my child." And he began to see Morgan's reminder not as advice from a wise elder to a younger actor, but as a simple human truth offered from one person to another. In the end, what you will remember most is not how impressive you were, but how fully you showed up, for others, and for yourself. He let the curtain fall back into place and turned off the lamp. The room dimmed, but the unease that had followed him and softened into something gentler, more spacious. Not all his questions were answered, but he no longer felt compelled to outrun them. Before getting into bed, he picked up his phone, not to scroll through notifications, but to open his contacts. His thumb hovered over a few names. Eventually, he chose one almost at random, someone he hadn't spoken to in too long. It was late, so he didn't call. Instead, he typed a simple message. "Just thinking of you. Hope you're doing okay." He sent it, then put the phone down without waiting for a reply. It was a small act, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of his busy life. But it was real. It was a step, however tiny, toward the kind of presence he wanted to cultivate. He lay down, pulled the covers over himself, and closed his eyes. For the first time in a while, the silence of the room didn't feel like an empty space to be filled, but like a gentle pause between breaths. Somewhere, deep within, the shape of his gratitude began to change. It was no longer a weight pressing him forward, demanding more. It became